In media, you'll occasionally come across characters who don't change a single time throughout a story. We call these characters static characters, a term that oftentimes carries a negative connotation because characters who don't have a character arc are typically not very liked or can be difficult for an audience to connect with most of the time. One Piece is no stranger to these types of characters, but because the series is nearly 1,200 chapters, you'd imagine that there can't be that many static characters after having that long to develop and change throughout the series. However, One Piece is special, because our very beloved main character, Monkey D. Luffy, is both a static character and, in my opinion, the best character in the entire series. Now, of course, Luffy does have moments of growth in both his strength and his knowledge about the world, but when you get down to his core ideals, he has unshakable principles that have existed since chapter 1 of the story and will continue to exist all the way to the end of the story. But this video isn't about how Luffy can be a fantastic character despite his unchangingness, nor is it about how he's unique amongst the other manga protagonists surrounding him. Rather, instead, in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into one of the most controversial, contentious, and heavily debated aspects of Luffy's character across the entire One Piece fandom, the ever-coveted question, is Luffy a hero? Whether you're a One Piece fan who's actively seeing this conversation pop up again recently, a One Piece fan who's never heard of this famous debate, or even someone who hasn't seen a single episode of One Piece, I promise you regardless that by the end of this video, you will understand why Luffy's character is so compelling despite being static, as well as have a clear answer to the question, is Luffy a hero? And it's an answer you might not expect if you watch all the way to the end of the video. If you end up enjoying this video, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel and I'd super appreciate it. Now let's talk about the misunderstood mind of Monkey D. Luffy. I want to start with the opinion that I think most One Piece fans originally side with when it comes to this debate, and the one that probably incites the most discussion whenever it's brought up, that of course being Luffy is not a hero. Recently, this take has been brought up through the lens of real-world protests and political unrest around the world. If you aren't aware, the Straw Hats' Jolly Roger has become a symbol of rebellion in multiple countries across the globe, leading to discussions about what sides of real-world issues Luffy would support and who would gain the favor of our beloved main character when it comes to real-world politics. In response to these discussions online, multiple One Piece fans as well as YouTubers alike have claimed that no, Luffy is not a hero and that is a silly thing to say. Before we talk about if that take is correct or not, I think it's important to look at where this opinion comes from in the first place, as well as specific examples from the story that support this claim. The most obvious one, and the one that first comes to most fans' mind, is in Fishman Island when Luffy explicitly says, "A hero? Forget it. I want to eat meat. Pirates eat meat and have big parties, but heroes give their meat to poor people." After seeing this panel, it does become fairly simple to claim that Luffy doesn't want to be a hero, he denounces the idea of being one himself, so that's the end of that. However, I do think the hilarity of this statement, as well as the focus on food here, does make it kind of hard to use this panel alone as evidence for this argument, so instead let's just look at Luffy's broader actions in the story. Luffy is constantly selfish in the story and almost exclusively acts on his own desires. In Marineford, Luffy doesn't care for the injustice engulfing the war, he just wants to go and save Ace. In Dressrosa, Luffy rejects leadership and refuses to lead the rebellion, instead he just wants to beat Doflamingo and leave. It is constantly reinforced that Luffy doesn't really care for the greater good, his morality is not societal, it's internal. But before we decide if that internal, selfish morality is enough to justify the claim that Luffy is not a hero, as most people do, there's actually another aspect of his character that heavily reinforces this selfishness. One of the most interesting dynamics in One Piece that I feel like is not talked about enough by One Piece fans is how Luffy treats major villains in the story. When you take a look at the level of severity Luffy treats the main villain of an arc with, and also the specific moments that either ramp up or de-escalate that severity or seriousness, the very internal focus of his morality becomes even more clear. There are countless examples you could look at in the story, but I think the best ones to look at are Arlong, Rob Lucci, Kaido, and Kizaru. Starting with Arlong, you can really easily see Luffy's morality in action in the way he completely dismisses Arlong's rule until Nami asks for help. Luffy does not care about the village history or the cruel reign that Arlong has over the villagers. In fact, he makes it a point to the rest of his crew that he won't even touch this conflict until Nami herself asks for help. And then, of course, we get one of One Piece's most famous early scenes, where Nami asks for help, and Luffy and the gang walk to Arlong Park to right some wrongs. This is a great example of how Luffy's morality is so internalized, he does not care at all about the greater good until his friend is involved. It's the same in Water 7, where there are countless issues surrounding the relationships of Iceberg and his shipwrights. Iceberg was a literal target of assassination multiple times, and Luffy still did not care about it until Robin was involved. The same goes for Enies Lobby, where Luffy spared no second thought about Rob Lucci's past as a psychopathic murderer, and he only has a vendetta against Rob Lucci because of his previous fight with him, as well as his friendship with Robin. You probably get the point already, but it also goes the other way too. Luffy's morality is so internalized to himself and his friends that you can even see Luffy take opponents less seriously if his friends aren't in as much conflict. I often see a lot of criticism about how Luffy didn't take Kaido as seriously as he should have on the rooftop in Wano, considering what was at stake for the country, but when you look at what Kaido was doing, it once again makes sense for how Luffy's character works. Kaido threatened the country of Wano and the citizens that Kinemon and Momonosuke care about, which is why Luffy agreed to fight Kaido in the first place, but Kaido chose to stay on the roof and fight against Luffy. He never once went down and tried to find someone weaker or kill Luffy's crewmates unless he thought Luffy was out for the count already. You can see a clear example of this with Luffy's first encounter against Kaido versus his final encounter against Kaido. The reason Luffy's attitude in his first encounter with Kaido is so different is because in the beginning of Wano, Luffy presumes that Kaido had just killed all of his teammates with a Boro breath on top of the mountain, so he is enraged and cares a lot about defeating Kaido here. But in the climax of Wano, Luffy knows that as long as he keeps fighting and as long as he stays up, his friends would be safe. This is why we see Luffy laugh and have a fun time against Kaido despite the insane circumstances of this raid, because Luffy doesn't care about the societal impact of any of this, or really what happens to the citizens of Wano at all. He only cares about his friends. Of course, Luffy's friends are Kinemon and Momonosuke, and what they care about is important to Luffy, which is why he's trying in the first place here, but if it wasn't for them, it's hard to say Luffy would be fighting Kaido at all. Lastly, it's the same for Kizaru in Egghead Island. Yes, Luffy has a pretty sour history with Kizaru, but not only has that been rectified by him already reuniting with his crew, additionally when you look at Luffy's motivations in Egghead, his actions and level of seriousness in this fight also makes so much sense. Luffy is trying to stall Kizaru so his crewmates can take Vegapunk off of the island. This is why Luffy is so happy-go-lucky and carefree when fighting Kizaru. Yes, Gear 5 kind of puts him into that funny state as well, but if he knew that some of his crewmates were in immediate danger, or if Kizaru had done something to them prior during this arc, Luffy would not be this carefree, he'd be a lot more serious. When it comes to Luffy's character, you can really only describe his decision-making as selfish and internalized, which really lends itself to the claim that Luffy is not a hero, and it becomes painstakingly obvious through his interactions with every villain in the story. So why is this even a discussion then? If Luffy's actions only lean into him being unheroic, and if he himself claims to dislike heroes, where does this argument even come from? Why do some people think Luffy is a hero? Well, there are the obvious things, like Luffy liberating nations everywhere he goes, as well as his literal new epithet becoming Warrior of Liberation, but if those things just happen to be byproducts of his selfishness that he isn't even aware of, is it enough to call him a hero? Well, we haven't looked at it in this video yet, but let's take a peek at what the actual definition of a hero is. A hero is a person who is admired or idealized for courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. Now, if your own personal definition of what a hero is must contain the word selfless, then I don't think there's any way you could accept Luffy as a hero, and that's okay. But by the definition, is he a hero? Is he admired or idealized for his courage and his noble qualities? Let's take a look into the story again, but this time we'll do it from the other side of the coin. If Luffy is selfish, then why are there countless examples of people across the One Piece world indebted to him and his actions? He saved Alabasta from Crocodile and earned the gratitude of an entire nation. He freed Dressrosa from Doflamingo's tyranny and liberated Wano from Kaido's oppression. Each of these countries now flies its own flag of freedom because of Luffy's actions, even if they are selfish. Could the acts of a man so self-serving, so driven purely by his own desires, truly be considered noble or heroic? I think this is where we need to re-examine what selfishness actually means when it comes to Luffy specifically. When most people hear the word selfish, they think of greed, ego, or moral apathy. But it's different for Luffy. His selfishness doesn't come from malice, it comes from honesty. He never pretends to fight for justice or the world or some higher principle. He fights because it feels right for him. He helps because he wants to, not because he's told to. That authenticity is what makes people trust him. In a world full of pirates, marines, and revolutionaries, all with very hidden motives and conflicting ideologies across the globe, Luffy is the only person who's completely transparent in all of One Piece. He's an open book at all times. When he says something, you know he means it. When he moves, you know it's from his heart, not from obligation. And because of that, people rally behind him. And it's not because he's virtuous, it's just because he's always 100% real. Vivi followed him because she saw someone who cared for his friends. Law followed him because he recognized that same honest will. Luffy doesn't convince others with logic or speeches, he inspires them by existing at his truest self. His so-called selfishness, the very same selfishness that people use to claim he isn't a hero, becomes contagious. It gives others permission to be free, to act without guilt, to live authentically. And when enough people start doing that, empires fall, nations change, and people's hearts are heroically freed. His freedom liberates others without him even realizing it, which is exactly why his Devil Fruit turned out to be what it is and why it's such a genius writing decision from Oda, because he is the figure of a god who is laughingly, uncaringly freeing people with his whimsy, selfish desires. Luffy is selfish, and he only cares about himself and his friends, and if you need to be selfless to be a hero, then maybe you can't call Luffy heroic. But without a doubt, that selfishness has caused others to rally around his transparent honesty, leading to the liberation of so many people. However, there's still a missing piece here, because this kind of authenticity alone isn't enough to claim that Luffy is a hero, nor is the lone byproduct of his selfishness, a byproduct that he himself isn't even aware of, noble enough of an action to claim he's a hero. There is something deeper about Luffy and the choices he makes, using that selfishly guided moral compass. If Luffy's selfish transparency was as honest as I describe it to be, you'd imagine there would be examples of his whims helping the wrong people, or examples of Luffy getting taken advantage of. However, there isn't. Time and time again, Luffy's selfishness leads to heroism only for the right people, and we can thank his incredible emotional intelligence for that. Luffy does what he wants. He only cares for himself and his friends, as we've established time and time again in this video. Yes, those selfish actions lead to the liberation of nations and the trampling of evil regimes throughout the entire story. And yes, his selfish nature leads to such an honest transparency that he becomes a heroic figure in the hearts of many, all like we just spoke about. But the biggest aspect of what makes Luffy who he is, the most compelling part of his amazing character, the piece that makes all of those selfish actions truly heroic, is the way his actions only ever benefit good people. Maybe you just want to chalk this up to Oda's writing conveniences, saying he'd never have the main character Luffy and his actions aid a villain or a bad person. But to me, I honestly and earnestly believe that Luffy's emotional intelligence is so sharp that those selfish desires truly only end up helping the good people of the world, because Luffy always has an accurate judge of character from the very moment he meets somebody. Look at characters like Kobe, Zoro, Nico Robin, Vivi, Brook. Luffy knows when someone is a good person, and that trait doesn't just apply to his close friends and crewmates. It applies to groups, even nations, on a larger scale as well. It goes the opposite way too. Look at Blackbeard, Enel, the Celestial Dragons, Kaido. Luffy knows immediately with very little interaction who not to trust and who is inherently worthy of those selfish acts of his. It's not like he makes a decision about this in his head either, he just knows. It's automatic for him. His selfish actions only end up benefiting good people who need it the most because of how spot on his emotional intelligence is, so even if he isn't aware of it, it's hard to say he's not heroic. Luffy's justice is not societal in any way. It is entirely internal. He is selfish and only acts on what he believes is best for himself and his friends, but that very internal justice is so honest, so transparent, and is constantly applied to the good people of the world because of Luffy's emotional intelligence. That very selfish behavior ends up giving the world exactly what it needs and when it needs it the most, because at his core, Luffy is a good, honest person with an amazing judge of character on top of it all. And at the end of the day, heroes don't define themselves. The world defines them. And in both the world of One Piece, as well as in real life, it is damn hard to say that Monkey D. Luffy, in his overwhelming emotional intelligence, his love for freedom, his constant acts of liberation, and his transparent, authentic selfishness, is anything but a hero, despite what he wants to call himself. Monkey D. Luffy is a hero. But lastly, what I want to convey most with this video is, does it even matter? Now, I'm not talking about the topic of the video when I say that. I think it's important to me, so I think it's important to make a video about it. It's as simple as that. But what I do mean is that who cares if it's a mischaracterization of Luffy? Maybe everything I said in this video is incorrect, and I'm just not informed on how Oda wanted to write Luffy, and he's not a hero. Does that really matter if people are using the Straw Hats Jolly Roger as a symbol of hope and the actions of Monkey D. Luffy to bring good into the real world? Does any of this even matter? Although I disagree, maybe the people who are saying Luffy wouldn't care about these real world issues are correct, and he really wouldn't side with the just forces of the world, nor would he help the political unrest that's happening today. Maybe that's all true. But what matters to me is that people are using the symbol of Luffy, his existence in the story, as a symbol of hope in real life. Luffy is causing people to get up out of their seats and go fight for what they believe is correct in the world. And to me, that makes him more of a hero than anything I could have expected when I started One Piece, and I think that's what really matters. Not whether or not calling Luffy a hero is a mischaracterization. He's causing real world change, and I think that makes him a hero. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. If you happen to enjoy the video, I'd super appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. I'd love to have you on board the channel. And also leave a comment what you think about this whole Luffy thing. Do you disagree with everything I just said? Do you agree with everything I just said? Are there things that I missed? Are there bits and pieces of what I said that you want to pick out and write about in the comments? I'm going to make an effort to read everything you guys have to say, and I'm really curious about this discourse in general, which is why I'm making a video about it in the first place. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.